A young couple bought a house on the cheap and thought they had gotten lucky, but a strange mound near the shed grew over the years until they finally decided to dig it up. What they found inside prompted them to call the police immediately. Subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching from. The long drive out of the city had left Marks's hands sore from gripping the steering wheel, but he did not complain. Beside him, Evelyn sat with her head tilted against the window, watching the rows of trees and distant rooftops of the suburbs roll past in a blur. The air here was different, softer and fresher than in the cramped apartment complex they had left behind. It carried with it the promise of quiet nights, a backyard of their own, and the sense of permanence that neither of them had known before. They had spent years dreaming of this, years saving every extra dollar, every holiday bonus, skipping vacations so that one day they could claim a place that was theirs alone. And now at last they had arrived. When they pulled into the driveway, the house loomed before them like a tired sentinel that had once stood proud but had grown weary with age. The two-story structure, with its faded paint and weather-beaten siding, looked as though it had witnessed decades of laughter, arguments, and secrets. The front porch sagged slightly on one side, the railings chipped and worn, but to them, even this imperfection seemed charming. Evelyn stepped out of the car and breathed deeply, letting the cool suburban air fill her lungs. She closed her eyes, imagining the garden she could plant here, the evenings they would spend together on that porch, the possibility of children playing one day in the yard. Yet even in the midst of their excitement, her gaze was drawn past the house toward the backyard, where an odd rise in the earth caught her attention. At first glance, it resembled the sort of mound that might form when rainwater shifted soil over time, but its size was unusual. It stood several feet high, a broad swell of earth pressed against the shadow of an old garden shed. Evelyn frowned but said nothing. She reminded herself that it was their first day, and perhaps she was simply being too observant, too critical. After all, the realtor had explained the house came with minor landscaping quirks. Marks was too busy unloading the car and hauling boxes toward the door to notice her unease. He whistled softly as he worked, his enthusiasm shining through despite the long drive. "Home," he said at one point, wiping sweat from his forehead. Just that single word seemed to carry all the weight of their shared sacrifices, the countless nights planning for a place of their own. Evelyn smiled faintly and joined him, yet her eyes wandered again to the backyard. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and wood polish. The floors creaked beneath their steps. The staircase railing shook when Evelyn tested it with her hand, but none of that mattered. The high ceilings and wide windows let sunlight spill across the rooms, illuminating possibilities. The living room, though empty, already seemed to hum with the anticipation of furniture, laughter, maybe even family gatherings. In the kitchen, she ran her fingers along the worn counters, imagining how she would transform the space into something bright and welcoming. Later that afternoon, the realtor stopped by to finalize paperwork and hand them the keys. He was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and an eager smile that never quite reached his eyes. Marks, brimming with questions, asked casually about the backyard mound. The realtor chuckled nervously and brushed it off. "Oh, that. Just old soil movement. Happens in places like this, especially near sheds or when the ground settles. Nothing to worry about." He spoke quickly, changing the subject back to the boiler and electrical wiring, but Evelyn caught the faint flicker in his expression, a shadow of discomfort he tried to conceal. When the realtor left, they lingered on the porch as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. Neighbors walked their dogs along the street, waved politely, and called out words of welcome. One elderly woman across the road studied them a little too long before nodding and disappearing into her house. Another man trimming his hedges glanced toward the backyard before shaking his head and muttering something under his breath. Evelyn noticed these small details, storing them silently in her mind. That night, exhaustion pulled them to bed quickly, but sleep did not come easily. The house creaked with the cooling of the day, the timbers shifting as though adjusting to new occupants. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, sharp and anxious. Evelyn stirred awake, listening intently. Then she felt it, a faint tremor under the mattress, so subtle she almost doubted it. She sat up, holding her breath, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Lying back down, she told herself it was the stress of the move, her imagination running wild in an unfamiliar space. The following morning, while Marks busied himself with unpacking tools in the garage, Evelyn wandered to the backyard. The mound seemed larger now that she stood before it in daylight. Its slope was smooth, too deliberate to be natural, and the earth was darker than the soil around it. She crouched, pressing her palm to the ground. It felt strangely firm, almost hollow beneath the surface. Pulling her hand away, she shivered. The garden shed behind it leaned crookedly, its wooden panels warped with age, as though it had been forced slightly forward by the pressure of the earth. In the days that followed, they threw themselves into settling. They painted the living room, patched up the porch railing, replaced old locks and handles. Yet for Evelyn, the backyard became an unspoken concern. She would catch herself staring out the window while washing dishes, her eyes drawn to that persistent swell of earth. Sometimes at dusk, she thought she heard a low hum carried on the breeze, almost like the sound of machinery far underground. Marks dismissed her worries with a shake of his head. "It's nothing," he reassured her. "Old soil, roots, maybe a septic tank. We'll figure it out later." He spoke with the calm certainty of someone determined not to let small problems overshadow their newfound happiness. But Evelyn could not shake the feeling that the mound was not just soil or roots. It was waiting. One evening, as they returned from a walk, they encountered the same elderly neighbor they had seen on moving day. She paused at the edge of her driveway, her eyes fixed firmly on the backyard. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she addressed Evelyn. "That ground behind your shed, don't go digging where you don't belong." Then, without waiting for a response, she turned and hurried inside. Evelyn stood frozen, her skin prickling with unease. Later, lying in bed beside Marks, she tried to dismiss the encounter, but her mind replayed the woman's words again and again. Outside, a light breeze stirred the trees, and in the stillness of the night, Evelyn thought she felt the faintest vibration travel through the floorboards. She held her breath, heart pounding, and stared into the darkness. The house, their home, seemed to breathe around her, and from the backyard, the unseen presence of the mound loomed, silent and patient. And so the first days in their new house passed, wrapped in equal measures of joy and an undercurrent of unease. The promise of a bright future lingered in the air, but beneath it, hidden in the soil behind the shed, something older and darker seemed to wait, pressing upward toward the surface, slowly demanding to be found. The nights were the hardest for Evelyn. By day, she could keep herself distracted with chores, unpacking boxes, organizing cupboards, painting over the cracked walls that carried decades of history. The daylight softened her unease, convincing her that the house was nothing more than a structure in need of love. But as soon as evening fell, shadows stretched long across the backyard, and her attention was inevitably drawn back to that stubborn mound by the shed. She tried not to stare, but even when her eyes were elsewhere, she felt its presence pressing at the edge of her awareness, as though it were a silent figure lurking just beyond the windowpane. At first, she thought she was imagining things. Perhaps it was only her nerves after such a huge transition in their lives. Yet slowly, undeniably, she began to notice changes. She started taking pictures of the backyard with her phone, mostly as a way to convince herself that the mound wasn't growing. But when she compared the photos from week to week, there was no denying it. The slope was higher, the ridge more pronounced. She showed the photos to Marks one evening, while he was fixing the leg of a chair, but he only laughed, wiping his hands on a rag. Soil shifted, he reminded her. Rainfall could move the ground, roots could push upward. She was simply being too observant. Evelyn tried to believe him, but the evidence nagged at her. It wasn't only her eyes telling her something was wrong. Animals had begun to notice too. The dogs from across the street, usually so boisterous, would halt abruptly when passing the fence near the shed. Their hackles rose, their growls low and sustained, until their owners tugged them away. Birds that filled the morning with chatter would swoop and scatter when they passed overhead, steering clear of the place entirely. Evelyn even noticed a neighborhood cat that once prowled their garden now refused to cross into the yard at all, lingering at the edge of the property with watchful, unblinking eyes. One evening, as a storm rolled in, the unease came to a head. Rain lashed the windows, rattling against the glass like impatient fingers. The ground outside turned to mud, rivulets cutting paths through the garden soil. Evelyn stood at the back door, watching water stream down the mound slope. Then as a flash of lightning lit the yard, she caught sight of it, a glimmer of dull metal shining through where the soil had eroded away. She gasped, heart hammering, and pressed her forehead against the cold glass. In that brief moment of light, she was certain she had seen a sharp edge, a corner too angular to belong to nature. When she told Marks, he dismissed it. Probably just an old barrel, or maybe part of the shed foundation. You know how these older places are. People bury all kinds of junk. His voice was steady, but Evelyn noticed the slight hesitation in his eyes, the way he quickly turned back to his tools. She wanted to argue, to insist he look for himself, but exhaustion pressed down on her, and she let the matter drop. Yet that night, as she lay awake listening to the storm fade, she swore she could feel a vibration in the floorboards again, faint but insistent, as though something beneath the earth stirred restlessly. The following week, the dreams began. They came to Evelyn first, though she kept them to herself. She dreamed of the mound swelling and falling, like a chest taking slow, deliberate breaths. In the dream, she stood rooted in place, unable to move as the earth pulsed and shifted, and from the soil rose muffled sounds, voices, whispers, a hollow ringing that made her bones ache. She woke with a cry, sweat dampening her skin, only to find the night around her eerily still. Marks slept on, oblivious, his arm draped over her waist. She lay awake until dawn, her gaze fixed on the darkened window. The tension began to spill over into their days. Evelyn's nerves frayed with every passing hour, and though she tried to hide it, Marks noticed. He teased her gently at first, calling her superstitious, but as her unease grew sharper, their conversations soured into arguments. He accused her of letting paranoia steal their joy in the new house. She accused him of ignoring the obvious. The mound became a wedge between them, a subject neither could discuss without the air tightening around them. It was then that the neighbor's odd behavior returned to her thoughts. One afternoon, while bringing groceries inside, she caught the same elderly woman watching her from across the street. Their eyes met, and for a moment Evelyn thought the woman might cross over, might say something. But instead, the neighbor simply shook her head slowly, lips pressed into a thin line, and disappeared back into her house. That night, Evelyn told Marks, but he shrugged it off as gossip and old wives' tales. Still, the unease gnawed at her, whispering that the woman knew something they did not. As weeks passed, Evelyn became hyper-aware of every tremor, every strange vibration beneath her feet. Sometimes, standing near the mound in the early morning, she felt a subtle quiver pass through the ground, a shiver that made the hair on her arms rise. She leaned down once, pressing her ear to the soil, and thought she heard the faintest hum, like machinery buried deep underground. It frightened her so badly she stumbled back and refused to go near it for days. Her anxiety reached its peak when the mound cracked for the first time. It was late afternoon after a heavy rainfall. The soil, dark and wet, sagged in one spot, opening just enough to reveal a rusted seam of metal beneath. She called for Marks, her voice sharp with panic. He came quickly, and together they crouched by the exposed corner. He tapped it with the edge of a trowel, the metallic clang echoing unnaturally through the air. His brow furrowed as he examined it, but still he forced a reassuring smile. "Old debris," he insisted. "People bury things all the time. Probably an old storage tank or something left behind decades ago." But Evelyn saw the doubt flicker across his face. She saw the way he lingered on the metallic edge, the way his jaw tightened as if he were forcing himself to look unconcerned. For the first time, she felt certain he was lying not to her, but to himself. That night, she dreamed again. The mound loomed larger, towering over her, as soil slipped away in waves, exposing a great rusted door beneath. From within came a sound like a heartbeat, slow and relentless, and she awoke gasping, clutching the sheets as though they could tether her to reality. Marks, stirred by her movements, murmured in his sleep and rolled away. Evelyn lay awake until dawn, staring into the darkness, knowing deep inside that the mound was more than just earth and rust. By the time the following weekend arrived, the tension in the house was palpable. Evelyn avoided the backyard, while Marks began to eye it more often, curiosity warring with denial. He spent longer pauses at the kitchen window, his jaw tight, his hands idle as though he were listening for something he could not name. Their silence grew heavier, punctuated by small bursts of argument that quickly fizzled into unease. Neither wanted to admit it, but the mound had become the unspoken center of their lives. One evening, just as the sun began to set, a neighbor passing by with his dog paused at the fence. The dog barked wildly toward the shed, teeth bared, until the man pulled it back sharply. He caught sight of Marks watching from the porch and called out, his voice carrying an edge of warning. "You best leave that ground alone. People before you didn't listen. They're gone now." Then he tugged the dog away, leaving Marks standing in stunned silence. When he returned inside, Evelyn was waiting at the door, eyes wide, having heard every word. Neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, the weight of the neighbor's cryptic warning settling between them like a stone. Outside, the last rays of sunlight slipped away, and in the deepening shadows of the yard, the mound seemed to swell higher, as though the earth itself had been listening. The warning from the neighbor lingered in their minds long after he had disappeared down the street with his barking dog. It hung in the air inside the house, like smoke that refused to dissipate, clinging to their every thought. Evelyn tried to keep herself busy, cleaning, cooking, arranging the furniture they had slowly gathered. But no matter what she did, her gaze drifted inevitably toward the backyard. She could see the mound from the kitchen window, its curved silhouette pressed against the faint glow of the evening sky, and she felt it was watching her as much as she was watching it. Marks was quieter now, no longer brushing away her concerns with laughter. He would pause near the window too, his hands resting on the sill, his eyes fixed on the place where the soil had cracked to reveal its metallic secret. At night, their conversations grew strained. Evelyn's voice trembled with fear as she told him about her dreams, about the vibrations she thought she could still feel beneath the floorboards, about the whispering hum in the soil. Marks listened, his jaw tight, torn between comforting her and dismissing what sounded to him like superstition. But he could not deny what his own eyes had seen, the unmistakable gleam of rusted metal jutting from the earth after the storm. It haunted him in silence, wearing away at his skepticism until finally, one Saturday morning, he announced that he was going to settle the matter once and for all. He fetched his shovel from the garage, his motions deliberate, determined, as though by digging he could not only uncover the truth, but also reclaim control over their lives. Evelyn pleaded with him to wait, to call someone, to do anything except go at it alone. But he shook his head. "We can't keep living like this," he told her. "Whatever it is, we'll deal with it. But I need to see it with my own eyes." There was no humor in his tone, no dismissive smile this time, only a grim resolve that frightened her even more than his earlier laughter had. She followed him outside reluctantly, her arms folded tight against her chest. The morning was cool, the air sharp with the smell of damp earth from the rains that had swept through the night before. The mound glistened darkly under the sun, its surface slick with mud, and the metallic edge protruded more clearly now, daring them to reveal its full form. Marks planted the shovel into the ground with a forceful thrust, the blade sinking into the soft soil. He worked steadily, each scoop of dirt tossed aside with a grunt of effort, and as he dug, the hollow sound of metal beneath grew louder, ringing through the yard with each strike. Evelyn stood nearby, her heart pounding with each echo, her mind conjuring images of what might be buried below. A broken septic tank? An old storage container? Or something darker, something tied to the warnings that neighbors were too afraid to explain? She shivered despite the sunlight and wished she could drag him back inside, but his determination was unshakable. After half an hour of digging, the curved surface of a large hatch began to emerge, its outline unmistakable. It was circular, rimmed with bolts corroded from decades underground, and a heavy iron handle jutted from the center like the hand of a clock frozen in time. They both stared at it in silence, the weight of discovery pressing down on them. Evelyn felt a wave of dread wash over her, while Marks's expression was a mixture of triumph and unease. He brushed away clumps of dirt with his hands, revealing more of the hatch's weathered surface. The metal was pitted with rust, but still solid, the kind of craftsmanship built to last. He tapped it with the shovel, and the hollow clang that reverberated back made them both flinch. It was not a tank or a random piece of junk. It was a door to something buried beneath their yard. Before they could speak, a voice startled them. The elderly man from next door had approached, his eyes fixed on the hatch with grim recognition. His dog strained at the leash, whining and pulling back, desperate to escape. The man shook his head slowly, his voice low and urgent. "I told you to leave it alone. Others before you found it too. They thought it was nothing, thought it was worth exploring, but nothing good ever came of it." His gaze lingered on the hatch, then on them. "Whatever's down there, it's better left buried." Marks straightened, his chest heaving from the work, his clothes stained with soil. "What is it?" he demanded. But the neighbor only shook his head again, his face pale, and pulled his dog away without another word. Evelyn called after him, her voice breaking with desperation, but he did not answer, retreating into the safety of his house as though even speaking of it was dangerous. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the sound of their breathing and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Evelyn turned to Marks, her eyes wide with fear. "We can't open it," she whispered. But he was already examining the bolts, running his fingers over the corroded edges, his jaw set in defiance. "We have to," he said. "We've come this far. We can't just leave it." His words struck her like a blow. She wanted to scream at him, to drag him away, but she saw in his eyes the same stubborn resolve that had carried them through every struggle in their lives. That evening, unable to stop him, she watched as he fetched his toolbox and returned to the backyard. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in hues of red and gold, casting long shadows across the grass. Evelyn stood near the porch, arms wrapped around herself, as Marks crouched by the hatch with a wrench, straining against the rusted bolts. The first resisted fiercely, but with a sharp crack it gave way, the sound echoing through the yard like a gunshot. He worked methodically, one bolt after another, sweat dripping down his temples, until at last the hatch was freed. Together they gripped the iron handle, its surface rough and cold beneath their hands. With a groan of metal against metal, they heaved, and the hatch creaked open. A rush of air escaped from below, stale and heavy with the scent of rust, mold, and something chemical that burned Evelyn's throat. She coughed, stumbling back, her eyes watering, while Marks held the hatch open, peering into the darkness below. A ladder descended into the void, its rungs corroded but intact, disappearing into a blackness so deep their eyes could not penetrate it. For a long moment they said nothing, only stared into the open maw of the earth that had been hidden beneath their yard for who knew how many decades. Evelyn felt her skin crawl as the cold air seeped upward, carrying with it the sense of a place untouched by time, a place that had been waiting for them. She wanted to run, to slam the hatch closed and never speak of it again, but she knew from the look in Marks's eyes that he was already imagining what lay below, already consumed by the need to uncover the truth. The mound was no longer a mystery, it was a threshold, and as night fell around them, they stood at its edge, the first step into a secret buried deep beneath their new home. The hatch remained open through the night, as though the earth itself had exhaled and could not pull back what it had released. From the moment the bolts had given way, and the first breath of that stale, chemical-laced air had escaped into their yard, neither Marks nor Evelyn could quite bring themselves to close it again. They had sat for hours afterward, side by side on the porch, staring at the dark mouth of the opening. Every so often, Evelyn thought she saw a faint shimmer of movement inside, some trick of light and shadow far down the ladder, though when she blinked it was gone. The air that seeped up through the hatch carried not only the stench of decay and rust, but also a kind of presence, a feeling that something vast and long hidden stirred below. When dawn broke, Marks was the first to rise. He had barely slept, his eyes burning with exhaustion but alive with determination. Evelyn, pale and restless, followed him into the yard, clutching a flashlight in her trembling hands. She tried to reason with him one last time, begged him to wait, to call authorities, or at least seek guidance from the neighbors who clearly knew more than they said. But Marks could not be swayed. The secrecy, the warnings, the gnawing curiosity, all of it, had built to a point where he could no longer ignore the pull of the unknown. They approached the hatch together, the ladder leading into darkness, gaping like a throat. Marks tested the top rung with his boot. The metal groaned, but held. He glanced back at Evelyn, who stood frozen in place, her flashlight beam trembling across the opening. "I'll go first," he said. His voice was low but firm, the kind of tone that admitted no argument. Slowly he lowered himself into the hole, his body swallowed by shadow, rung by rung, until only his head remained visible. He nodded once, then disappeared entirely. Evelyn's heart pounded as she followed. Her hands gripped the ladder tightly, the rust flaking off beneath her fingers, leaving orange smears on her palms. The cold air pressed closer the farther she descended, and a dampness clung to the walls. By the time her feet touched the concrete floor below, she felt as though she had stepped not just underground but into another world entirely. The beam of Marks's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing a long corridor stretching away from them. The walls were lined with peeling paint, the concrete stained with watermarks. Thick electrical cables, long dead, sagged from hooks along the ceiling. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by their breath and movement, swirling in the light like pale ghosts. Their footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, each sound bouncing back with unnatural sharpness, as though the bunker itself was listening. They moved cautiously, exploring one room at a time. The first chamber they entered was filled with remnants of old furniture. A desk, its surface warped and covered with mold, a metal chair tipped on its side, and shelves lined with notebooks whose pages had fused together into blocks of paper. On the far wall hung a map of the world, yellowed and curling, dotted with pins that had long since rusted. Evelyn reached out to touch it but stopped, suddenly aware of the chill that radiated from the wall itself, as though the cold of decades underground had seeped into the very stone. Further inside, they discovered a larger room. Here the relics of the past loomed more clearly: radio transmitters with dials frozen mid-turn, speakers coated in dust, coils of wire spilling across the floor like tangled vines. In one corner lay crates marked with faded military insignia. Marks pried one open, the wood splintering, and inside found neatly stacked gas masks, their rubber stiff and brittle with age. He held one up, the glass of its eyepieces clouded, and for a moment Evelyn thought she saw her reflection inside distorted and alien. She turned away quickly, clutching the flashlight tighter. The bunker smelled of rust, mildew, and something sharper, an acrid tang that clung to the back of the throat. The deeper they went, the stronger it became. In one chamber, Evelyn nearly doubled over coughing, her eyes watering from the stinging air. Marks tried to reassure her, but even he looked unsettled by the invisible presence that seemed to saturate the place. It was not merely abandonment that weighed on these walls. It was secrecy. Something had been left here with the intention that no one should find it again. At last they reached the farthest room, a space sealed off with a heavy door that stood ajar. The hinges screeched as Marks pushed it open, and the beam of his flashlight fell upon a sight that froze them both. Lined against the back wall were several massive metal containers, their surfaces smooth and unmarked. No insignia, no numbers, nothing to suggest what they contained. Unlike the rusting equipment in the other rooms, these containers looked oddly intact, as though they had resisted the slow decay of time. Their presence was deliberate, purposeful, and wrong. Evelyn whispered that they should leave, her voice shaking with urgency. But Mark stepped closer. He ran his hand along the nearest container, his fingers tracing the cold surface. The metal hummed faintly beneath his touch. Or perhaps it was only his imagination, but the sound seemed to reverberate through the room. He looked around and found a table with paper strewn across it, the edges curled and yellowed. He gathered them carefully, brushing off dust. Most were filled with technical diagrams, lists of supplies, records of maintenance schedules, but interspersed among them were more chilling notes. Words like biosamples, quarantine procedures, and containment breach protocols, repeated in clipped handwriting. Evelyn read over his shoulder, her stomach turning cold. The more they uncovered, the more the pieces formed a picture neither wanted to believe. This was not just a shelter or supply depot. This was a laboratory or perhaps a vault where something dangerous had been hidden. Evelyn imagined the containers shaking in the earth, forcing the soil above to bulge upward year by year until the mound revealed itself. She imagined what might be sealed inside, waiting in silence all this time. Her flashlight flickered suddenly, the beam sputtering before steadying again. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows heavier. Evelyn felt as though the containers were watching them, though she knew that was impossible. Still, the sense of being observed was overwhelming. She grabbed Marks's arm, begging him again to leave, to close the hatch and never return. But he shook his head, his expression grim. "We need to know," he said softly. "We need to see what's inside." Evelyn's knees nearly buckled at the thought, yet she could see he was already searching for a way to open the nearest container. In that moment, she realized there was no stopping him. The curiosity that had gnawed at him for weeks had become a compulsion, a hunger that nothing short of revelation could satisfy. And so they lingered there, standing before the sealed containers in the stale, suffocating air of the bunker. Around them, the echoes of a bygone war clung to the walls, but beneath it pulsed something more immediate, more menacing, as if the decades between past and present had dissolved in the darkness. The mound in their backyard had not simply been a quirk of soil or an oddity of nature. It had been a warning sign, a silent reminder that the ground beneath their feet was never empty. It was filled with secrets, and now those secrets were stirring, demanding to be uncovered. The silence of the bunker pressed against them as if it were alive, as if the walls themselves had been waiting all these years for someone to break the seal. The beam of their flashlights swept across the sealed containers again and again, and every time Evelyn's stomach knotted tighter. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and chemicals, and though she tried to keep calm, every breath seemed to burn her throat. She wanted desperately to flee, to drag Marks back up the ladder and slam the hatch shut forever. But Marks stood firm, his eyes fixed on the containers with a look that was half fear and half hunger for the truth. He approached the nearest one, his footsteps echoing too loudly in the cavernous chamber. Evelyn's hand shot out, catching his arm. Her fingers dug into his sleeve as she whispered his name, a plea more than a warning. He met her gaze only briefly, long enough for her to see that his mind was set. The weeks of unease, the nights of arguing, the neighbor's cryptic words, all of it had built to this moment. He could not live with uncertainty gnawing at him. He had to know. With trembling hands, he found a latch along the edge of the container, one that had been concealed beneath layers of grime and corrosion. He tugged at it, the rust flaking away, the sound harsh in the silence. Evelyn turned her head, unable to watch, her heart slamming against her ribs. Then with a crack that echoed through the bunker like the shattering of a bone, the latch gave way. The lid groaned as he pulled it open, the hinges screaming in protest after decades of stillness. A foul wave of air rolled out, heavier and sharper than anything they had smelled before. Evelyn gagged, stumbling backward, her hand over her mouth. The flashlight beam quivered in her grasp, sweeping wildly across the floor. Marks peered inside, his face suddenly drained of color. For a heartbeat he stood motionless, as though frozen. Then he staggered back, his chest heaving. Evelyn rushed to his side, gripping his arm as though to anchor him, and together they looked into the container. Inside were rows of glass capsules, each sealed tight, suspended in racks of metal braces. The liquid inside them shimmered faintly in the light, yellowish and opaque, with strange fragments floating as though suspended in amber. Evelyn's mind recoiled from the sight, unable at first to understand what she was looking at. Then the shape of one fragment struck her, organic, unmistakably so. It was tissue, flesh, something once living, preserved and waiting. In another capsule, she saw something that looked like a partial organ, veins faintly visible beneath its pale surface. Her knees went weak, and she nearly collapsed. "What is this?" she whispered, but the answer hung unspoken between them. The documents they had found, the words scrawled in official reports, biosamples, quarantine, containment, all of it now came into focus. This was not a bunker for supplies or defense. It was a vault of experiments, a graveyard for things that had no right to exist outside the sealed glass. The air seemed to close in around them, the hum Evelyn thought she had imagined before now thrumming in her ears. Whether it came from the containers themselves or from her own blood pounding in terror, she could not tell. Marks slammed the lid shut, his face pale and drawn. He pulled her toward the door, his voice low and hoarse. "We have to get out of here." But they stumbled back into the corridor, their footsteps hurried and frantic. The bunker no longer felt abandoned, but hostile, the walls pressing in as if to trap them. Evelyn's chest ached with every breath, her throat raw from the chemical tang. Her flashlight beam jittered against the walls, illuminating peeling paint, collapsed cables, the relics of a war that had ended long ago but still cast its shadow here. All the while she could not shake the feeling that something had shifted when the container was opened, that their presence had awakened more than just old air. When they reached the ladder, Evelyn nearly shoved Marks upward, desperate to climb out. The rungs groaned under their weight, rust flaking away in their hands. But at last they emerged into the light of their backyard. The sky above was darkening with approaching clouds, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Evelyn doubled over, coughing violently, while Marks bent with his hands on his knees, sucking in great gulps of clean air. For a long while they said nothing, only stood beside the open hatch, gasping like survivors pulled from the sea. At last Evelyn found her voice. She seized Marks by the shoulders, her eyes blazing with desperation. "We have to call someone, now. We can't keep this here. Not near us, not near anyone. This is dangerous, don't you see? It's not ours to hide." He hesitated, glancing back at the gaping hatch, the shadow of the ladder disappearing into the depths. She saw the conflict on his face, the thought of authorities storming their home, the fear of losing the house they had fought so hard to claim. But then he remembered what he had seen inside that container, and the fight drained from him. He nodded slowly. Evelyn ran for the phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. When the voice on the other end answered, she struggled to explain, her words tumbling over one another in a rush. "There's something under our house. Something dangerous. Military. Biological. You need to send someone, please." The operator's tone shifted from skeptical to urgent as she stammered through the details, and within minutes they were told to remain outside, not to re-enter, that a team would arrive immediately. They waited in the yard, their eyes darting constantly to the hatch. Every gust of wind seemed to rise from its depths, carrying with it the faintest trace of that chemical stench. Evelyn held Marks's hand so tightly her knuckles ached, unwilling to let go. The minutes stretched into an eternity until at last the distant wail of sirens cut through the heavy air. Red and blue lights flickered against the houses as vehicles roared down the street, braking sharply in front of their home. Uniformed officers poured out, followed by men in protective suits carrying equipment. The neighbors had gathered at a distance, watching with wide eyes as the team fanned out across the lawn. Orders were shouted, the hatch cordoned off, and within moments the once quiet street was a scene of controlled chaos. Evelyn and Mark stood together at the edge of it all, overwhelmed by the sudden storm they had unleashed. One officer approached them, his face stern beneath his helmet. He asked sharp questions, his tone clipped, about how they had found the bunker, what they had touched, what they had opened. Evelyn answered as best she could, her voice trembling, while Mark stood silent, his jaw tight. When they admitted to opening the container, the man's expression darkened, and he barked orders to his team. More vehicles arrived, more men in suits, and the yard became a hive of activity as the secret beneath their home was brought into the open. As the night deepened, the couple stood together, watching their yard transform into a sealed-off operation. Spotlights blazed, illuminating the mound that had haunted them since the day they moved in. Technicians descended into the hatch, their voices echoing faintly from below, while others hauled equipment across the grass. The air buzzed with radios and machinery, the hum of urgency that Evelyn had felt in her bones now realized in full. She leaned against Marks, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. Neither spoke, for there was nothing left to say. The life they had imagined in this house, the quiet dream of starting fresh, had shattered the moment they opened the hatch. Whatever came next, they knew only one thing with certainty: nothing would ever be the same again. As the first drops of rain began to fall, the flashing lights painted the wet grass in harsh colors. Evelyn tilted her face to the sky, closing her eyes against the sting of tears. Somewhere behind her, the officer was speaking into his radio, his voice low but urgent. She caught fragments: containment, quarantine, hazardous material. Each word drove the reality deeper into her heart. The mound had been a warning, a scar left by a buried past. And in their stubborn search for truth, they had brought it back to the surface. She clung to Marx's hand as the rain fell harder. The sirens faded into the distance, and the bunker below their home was claimed by those who understood its danger better than they ever could. Yet even as the operation unfolded around them, she knew that the images of those capsules glimmering in the pale light would haunt her forever. And in the silence between the bursts of activity, she thought she could still hear it, the faintest hum rising from the earth, as though the secrets below were not finished yet, as though they had only just begun to wake. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss the next shocking story. Check out the other videos waiting for you right now. You won't believe what happens in them. And share this video with your friends so they can see it too.